Well, welcome to another SAFPAC seminar. I'm delighted that today we've got Charlie Gere, Professor of Media Theory and History at Lancaster University. And Charlie's going to be exploring with us a theme of bipedality, premature birth and desire, which I think is very much Charlie's desire, and we look forward to exploring that with him. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Del. So firstly, just to put this in context, this is part of a quite long book project. I mean, there is the sort of manuscript as it currently stands, looking at really rethinking what it means to be human from the perspective of feet. So thus the bipedality thing. I should say before starting, I am not a psychoanalyst, though I'm very interested in psychoanalysis. And maybe, I don't quite know how dangerous it is to say this kind of thing, but if I veer towards any kind of psychoanalysis, it'd be Lacanian. So this is quite Lacanian in as much as I understand Lacan. Okay, so I'm going to start reading. If anybody has some queries or doesn't understand something, please stop me, and maybe we'll stop at various points just to, for a possible discussion, is Del's suggestion. So I'll start. So in 2002, Google engineer Blake Lemoine declared that he believed the artificial intelligence application he's working on, LaMDA, which is language model for dialogue applications, was sentient. He was fired, but the idea that a machine could have consciousness is not only widely held, at least in the tech community, but is also part of a kind of Gnosticism that pervades our current digital culture. Okay. So back in 1999, in her book, How We Became Posthuman, Catherine Hales describes her shock at reading roboticist Hans Moravec's proposal for separating the mind and body. In her words, he, quotes, invents a fantasy scenario in which a robot surgeon purees the human brain in a kind of cranial liposuction, reading the information in each molecular layer as it is stripped away, and transferring the information into a computer. At the end of the operation, the cranial cavity is empty, and the patient, now inhabiting the metallic body of the computer, wakens to find his consciousness exactly the same as it was before. She asks, how was it possible for someone of Moravec's obvious intelligence to believe that mind could be separated from body? Even assuming such separation was possible, how could anyone think that consciousness in an entirely different medium will remain unchanged, as if it had no connection with embodiment? And we've seen this kind of thinking a lot in digital culture. Elon Musk is now currently one of the poster boys for this sort of thinking. It would seem that Lemoine and Moravec and many others in the tech world believe in what Fernando Vidal and Francisco Ortega, in their book Being Brains, Making the Cerebral Subject, describe as the cerebral subject, who is their brain. Vidal and Ortega look at the genealogy that has led scientists and philosophers declare that you are your brain, or where goes a brain, there goes a person, or the mind is what the brain does. This understanding first emerges in the 17th century, derived from a combination of John Locke's theory of personal identity and the corpuscular theory of matter, rather from the burgeoning anatomical studies. Corpuscularism, I've had difficulty pronouncing that, abandoned earlier notions of material continuity of bodies. In his essay concerning human understanding, Locke separated out substance and personal identity. Should the soul of a prince, carrying with it the consciousness of the prince's past life, enter and inform the body of a cobbler, as soon as deserted by his own soul, everyone sees that he would be the same person with the prince, accountable only for the prince's actions. That's a quote from Locke. Thus, the person who looks like the cobbler would, according to Locke, actually be the prince. Locke imagined sensations being conveyed through the organs or the nerves, which are the conduits to convey them from without to their audience in the brain, the mind's presence room, as he calls it. As Ortega and Vidal put it, with Locke, bodies become things we have, not things we are. In turn, personal identity becomes purely psychological and distinct from bodily identity. So now I want to engage with a kind of critique of this, starting with a response to a question from Noam Chomsky made by Jacques Lacan, who suggested that, quote, we think with our brains. Personally, I think with my feet. That's the only way I really come into contact with anything solid. I do occasionally think of my forehead when I bang into something, but I've seen enough electroencephalograms to know there's not the slightest trace of a thought in the brain. And this reminded me of a quote from Olga Tokarczuk's novel, Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of Your Dead, which I don't know if you know it, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist, for whom the narrator says, I've always regarded the feet as the most intimate and personal part of our bodies, and not the genitals, not the heart, or even the brain, organs of no great significance that are too highly valued. It is in the feet that all knowledge of mankind lies hidden. The body sends them a weighty sense of who we really are and how we relate to the earth. It's in the touch of the earth, at its point of contact with the body, that the whole mystery is located. The fact that we are built of elements of matter while also being alien to it, separated from it. The feet, those are our plugs into the socket. So it is definitely true that bipedality, the fact we walk on 2 feet as opposed to 4 limbs, enables pretty much all the things that we believe make us human and special. In the paleoanthropologist André Louis-Gahon's words, everything begins with the feet. Or as Marvin Harris puts it, another anthropologist puts it in his book, Our Kind, in the beginning was the foot. He asks, why did nature fashion an ape that walked on 2 legs? And then answers his question like this. The answer must lie in the ability of such a creature to prosper on the ground. No large animal walks upright on tree limbs, much less jumps on 2 legs from branch to branch. But mere ground dwelling cannot account for upright posture. Living on the ground is exactly what mammals do best. And from elephants to cats, horses and baboons, they get about on all 4s. A 2-footed, 2-handed ape makes evolutionary sense only because it could do something on the ground that no other creature had ever done so much of or done so well. Use hands to make and carry tools, and use tools to satisfy daily needs. So bipedality is at the heart of paleoanthropologist Louis-Gahon's book, Gesture and Speech, in which he developed his understanding of the relationship between the human and techniques, and in particular language. Following discovery by Louis B. Leakey in the late 1950s of early hominid remains, which were upright, bipedal, and bearing evidence of tool use, yet with comparatively small brain capacity. As far as he is concerned, humans not descended from apes, but as close to them as, in his example, a horse to a rhinoceros. For Louis-Gahon, the emergence of human language and tool use is thus the result not of expanded brain capacity, but of becoming upright. The brain was not the cause of locomotor adaptation, but their beneficiary. The achievement of upright posture frees the hands for tool use, which in turn eventually frees the lower jaw for language. The upright posture also enables the spinal column to support a heavier brain case, enabling the expansion of the cortical fan in the cerebellum, the cortex being the area of the brain that controls speech. Louis-Gahon proposes that tool use, far from being the result of expanded intelligence, is a zoological and evolutionary phenomenon, much like the acquisition of a claw excluded from the body. For French philosopher Bernard Stiegler, Louis-Gahon showed that it is, quote, impossible to disassociate anthropogenesis from technogenesis, which, quote, pursues the conquest of mobility, that is of life, by means other than life. And that accordingly, the difference between human and animal kind is to be rethought, and that the technological exteriorization of the living marks the origin of humanity, and the technical object constitutes as such a memory support. At the beginning of the first volume of his magnum opus, Techniques and Time, Stiegler asks who or what does the inventing and who or what is invented. What he means by this is that it's difficult to determine what comes first, humans or tools. For Stiegler, we're always already technical, in a state of originary technicity. According to Stiegler, for Louis-Gahon, it is the tool, that is techne, that invents the human, not the human that invents the technical. Or the human invents himself by inventing the tool, by becoming exteriorized technologically in the form of tools such as flint axe heads. I think that's a good point to stop. If anybody's got any queries or thoughts about that, or wants me to explain anything, you know.
I was going to ask if you could just read those last few sentences again.
Yeah, absolutely. The Stiegler stuff.
Yeah, just one. Yeah, about the tool. Yeah.
So in his book, Techniques and Time, Stiegler asks who or what does the inventing? Yeah. It's a who or a what. Who or what is invented. What he means by this is that it is difficult to determine what came first, humans or tools. For Stiegler, we're always already technical, in a state of originary technicity. And he looks to Leroy-Gahon to say, it is the tool, that is techne, the Greek for tool, that invents the human, not the human that invents the technical. Or perhaps the human invents himself by inventing the tool, by becoming exteriorized in the form of tools such as flint axe heads. Yeah. So this is a way of completely deconstructing the notion that somehow we owe our technicity to our expanded brains, saying rather the brains are a phenomenon to do with tool use. It's the other way around, what you might expect. It reverses the normal kind of progressive understanding of human evolutionary development.
Charlie, that sounds new, a really interesting way of looking at things. But earlier on, I was surprised that maybe you did, and I didn't hear it. You didn't mention Merleau-Ponty, which seemed to maybe speak about a lot of things.
Yeah, no, completely. And Merleau-Ponty is, of course, in the rest of the book. I'm taking those bits out that I think will work as a paper. Yes, I mean, Merleau-Ponty is part of that refinding of the body. Also Heidegger. I know we're not supposed to talk about Heidegger, but I find it ever fascinating. And Heidegger, perhaps more than Merleau-Ponty, is a really important influence on Stiegler via Derrida in terms of reversing this kind of understanding of what we are phenomenologically in relation to our, if we're talking Heideggerian terms, we talk about Darsine's use of the thing as tool, maybe, as something that's our prime relationship to the world is as a sort of things we use. And you're gone.
Could you just say a little bit more about Stiegler?
Yeah, okay. Bernhard Stiegler, very interesting person. I know him very slightly. He originally went to jail for robbing a bank early in his life, at which point he started going interested in philosophy, ended up doing a PhD with Jacques Derrida, and took some of the implications of Derrida's work, particularly around of grammatology, and the way that Derrida cites this paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gahon, and in a way runs with it in order to produce this very well articulated over several volumes notion of originary technicity. So he is the person who really, in a sense, takes hints from Heidegger and Derrida and produces a full-blown theory that we are invented by our techniques as much as the other way around. And yeah, if that makes sense. Unfortunately, he killed himself a few years ago, which is rather sad, but he was a very interesting, if rather complex man.
Can I just ask one thing? You were talking about someone who said, I think with my feet. Was that Chomsky or Derrida? I didn't quite.
Oh, sorry, it was Jacques Lacan.
It was Lacan.
Yeah. Lacan is in Rudinesco's Life of Lacan, apparently in a conversation with Noam Chomsky. I think he was, he's being naughty, I think, to some extent. I think he was trying. But the provocation is interesting because in some ways, even though it may be slightly flippant, there are ways in which, as I go on, I think you'll see some of the ways that also finds different expression, I think, in some of Lacan's work.
Yeah, I think it's great. I don't know how it will come out, but I think it's great because of the whole thing about we do have to sort of think on our feet all the time.
Yeah. I spent the last 5 years thinking about nothing but feet. It's become quite burdensome in some ways, but it's quite boring for my colleagues and friends and students. Everything comes back to feet.
Is it an irony that you're doing a lot of your thinking sat down as well?
There's a whole bit. I go to Tim Ingold. He has a whole bit about the fact that sitting down is actually unnatural, and that it divorces us from our feet. It's literally funny thing. Every time somebody suggests something, I've always got there first because I spent so long thinking about this. It's always, it's become so obsessive, this whole thing about feet, that I can't. I think I've captured not every, but every possible variation of the theme of feet, or a large amount of them. But yes, I'm sitting down right now. Last time I gave this paper, I did it standing up, and I walked around because I felt it was appropriate. It's exhausting. Shall I go on, or has anybody got any other questions? because I want to now deepen the argument, because this is the point at which I add something to what I think Stiegler has done that then brings me around to Lacan, but I'll explain as we go on. Thus, for Stiegler and Le Wagahorn, all human culture is a result of our bipedality. But there is one consequence of our bipedality that they do not take account of in their understanding of originary technicity. Bipedality enables the evolution of a brain case too large to easily fit through the bipedal female human pelvis. We are born months before we should be, and as infants among the most helpless among all animal species. This necessitates a long period of intense care and therefore a uniquely close relationship with the primary carer, usually the mother. It is this relationship and its closeness that instigates the unsatisfiable desire that curves around the void left by that relationship. This is a source of what Julia Kristeva names as the abject. And this is a quote from Kristeva. The abject confronts us, on the other hand, and this time within our personal archaeology, with our earliest attempts to release the hold of the maternal entity, even before existing outside of her, thanks to the autonomy of language. It is a violent, clumsy breaking away, with the constant risk of falling back under the sway of a power as securing as it is stifling, end quote. So Lacan, I think, knew all this. According to Jacques Lacan, just in case I swallowed that bit, knew all this. According to Lorenzo Chiesa, Lacan postulates a primordial biological discord between man and his environment, centered on premature birth, and a subsequent disordered imagination from which language and the symbolic arise immanently. Chiesa suggests that for Lacan, the human being is born with fetalized traits, that is to say, deriving from premature birth, or neoteny, as it's sometimes called. As Stephen Jay Gould argues in Ontogeny and Phylogeny, his book about sort of conditions of birth, being born, neoteny has been probably the major determinant of human evolution. And Timothy Taylor, another evolutionary scientist, suggests that human beings should not exist. Our skulls are so large that we risk being stuck and dying even as we struggle to be born. Helped out by a technical team, obstetrician, midwife, and a battery of bleeping machines, the unwieldy cranium is followed into the light by the pathetic excuse for a mammalian body, screaming, hairless, and so muscularly feeble that it has no chance of supporting its head properly for months. How did a species in which basic reproduction is so easily fatal and whose progeny needs several years of adult support before they can dress themselves, not just evolve, but become the dominant species on the planet, capable of inhabiting every environment from the tropics to the poles, the coast to the high continental plateau, prospecting under mountains and across the ocean floor, end quote from Taylor. In his essay For a Philosophy of Infancy, Agamben invokes the figure, Giorgio Agamben, sorry, the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, I should say, invokes the figure of the axolotl, a Mexican salamander that is an example of neoteny, in that it resembles the larvae of other amphibians and yet could reproduce. For Agamben, this is true also of humans. He suggests that this would explain a number of human morphological characteristics, from the position of the occipital foramen to the shape of the ear's auricle, from hairless skin to the structure of the hands and feet, that do not correspond to those of adult anthropoids, but to those of their fetuses. Traits that are transitory in primates, having humans become definitive, somehow bringing to pass in flesh and bone the type of the eternal child. Above all, however, this hypothesis allows us to explain in a new way the language and the whole exosomatic tradition, brackets, culture, close brackets, that more than any genetic imprint characterize Homo sapiens, end quote. This allows the human to, quote, any destiny and specific environment as to solely follow its own indeterminacy and immaturity. Agamben continues that while other animals, the mature ones, merely obey the specific instructions written in their genetic code, the neotenic infant finds itself in the condition of also being able to pay attention to that which is not written, of paying attention to arbitrary and uncodified somatic possibilities. In its infantile totipotency, it would be thrown outside of itself, not as other living beings are, into a specific adventure and environment, but for the first time into a world. Shall I stop there just for any questions?
Please.
Any questions? I mean, just to sort of clarify that bit a bit, we are, because of the large brain case, etc., I believe that if we were to gestate till full maturity, we'd have to be in the womb for 22 months, as opposed to 9. And so really the whole of human existence is predicated around this extraordinary, premature birth in any mammalian sense, plus the need to be cared for and to have an openness to other things other than our genetic inheritance. If that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hence the title of your paper.
Hence the title of my paper. So, which leads the next bit of the argument. Has anybody got any questions before I go on? Okay. So, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the effects of neoteny. In her book, On Becoming Human, Nancy Tanner claims that the interrelations and feedback dynamics of social learning, increased cranial capacity and intelligence become obvious when...
Sorry, I have a question.
Sorry, go on.
So what are you saying, that if humans are born at 22 months, then...
If we were born at 22 months, which I think would be physically impossible, we would then be mature enough to exist within our genetic determination rather than be born as yet not fully equipped to exist in the world, and therefore in need of a kind of care which is unique in the animal kingdom. I mean, if you see a baby, it is the most evolutionarily useless thing you can imagine. I mean, it's completely helpless. Most mammals, to a lesser or greater extent, are able to fend for themselves pretty quickly. In some cases, it takes years. In my case, about 30 years to become even vaguely. But you know what I mean? I'm joking, but I mean, in a sense, they even become capable of surviving in a kind of environment. It's at least 18 months to 2 years.
And Charlie, are you going to say that because of this has an incredible effect on the nature of our desire?
Yes, I am going to say that. I haven't got there yet, but I'm going to say it. So I have to follow through to the next bit of the argument. I might, so just to say, I mean, there's a bit here which I think I might pass over because I can praise it. So various anthropologists such as Nancy Tanner point out how the consequences of this combination of premature birth, neoteny, prolonged infant dependency, so it leads to various things. Learning on 2 feet required more time to develop motor coordination than was true for the quadrupedal ancestral population. This in turn meant the mother or carer has to carry a child that can no longer cling as effectively, owing to change anatomy brought around by bipedalism. Human children can't cling to the mother. They have to be carried. So one consequence of this, cling to the fur. One consequence of this is there's quite a long, strong strain of feminist anthropology that suggests the first inventions were not flints, but they were carrying devices, bags, that were the sort of earliest kind of human inventions, which of course don't survive because they're less sort of sturdy in a sense. The child's foot evolved being bipedal along the grass mother, and bipedalism was effective for adults. It was less so for infants. And this is a quote from Tanner again. The young had to be physically cared for over an extended period because of the time required for motor development. The social implications of this fact must have been far-reaching. Social bonds between mother and offspring had to be close and intense, so she would give the infant and child the care necessary to its survival. The long-term contact with adults offers the young increased opportunity to watch adult activity at close hand and to learn about the environment, where to find foods, how to use tools effectively in a variety of ways, how to make tools, and where to find the raw materials. So in a sense, Tanner is saying the same thing as, in a way, to people like Loagahorn and Stiegler, that bipedality is the condition that enables the use of tools or promotes the use of tools. I'm just going to miss out this bit because I don't think it adds much to this. So just to jump into any questions about that, just before I go on, because I want to talk a bit about, I want to get back to psychoanalysis now.
I just wanted to say something maybe about, how to put it, that the nature of the child being so, dependent.
Yeah.
That obviously, or maybe not obviously, but it seems like it would hugely help create very strong relationships within the community.
Yeah.
Around that child, the whole idea of, it takes a village.
It takes a village, yeah, exactly.
The child's vulnerability would also have, kind of in a technological sense, have added to the creation of culture and language within a sort of communal, tribal kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
I think that's completely right. I haven't actually put that in, but you're right. There is a whole set of theories, isn't there, that the sort of need for care for children produces a far more communal ethos, possibly, that because the caring can be shared, that then promotes sociality and, in a sense, lays the ground for culture, I guess, in some ways. So absolutely. And in fact, you're right. That is a sort of lacuna I need to put into this bit of the paper, I think, or the chapter when it comes. But yeah, I'd entirely agree with that. It takes a village to raise a child. Yeah,
there's that idea that if a vulnerability exists or a weakness exists, in an evolutionary sense, then it requires a complex adaptation in order to overcome that. And I suppose in human, the social, cultural is the adaptation to the vulnerability that might occur in children.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, it raised an interesting point here. One of the things that I think is an interesting tension here is the degree to which those kind of adaptations are just evolutionary, and which they also, in a sense, go beyond the evolutionary, or rather they have in them their own dynamic. So one of Stiegler's ideas is that whereas we as humans have more or less stabilized in biological evolutionary terms about 30,000 years ago, we're not massively different to sort of Neolithic people in terms of our brain size and capacity, but our techniques keep on evolving. They evolve at ever faster rates. And so there is a kind of sense that, on one hand, you could say that these cultural adaptations are just evolutionary. There's, a nuclear power station is just another form of nature, an evolutionary solution. On the other hand, you can say it also exceeds, in an exponential way, the sort of comparatively slow rates of evolutionary development. And I think that's and that's the cusp, is where we go from what may be seen still as just evolutionary adaptations, early tools, to something that starts to have its own dynamic.
You're sort of saying there's something on, we're not really mature enough in some ways to be dealing with all the things that we've created for ourselves. I
can't just say, Christ, no. I mean, we're like sort of cave people with mobile phones and nuclear weapons. It's absolutely appalling. I mean, every time I think about our state of technological advancement against our comparative biological maturity, I panic.
Yeah.
Part of what I'm trying to say in this thing is, the techniques has its own kind of dynamic of evolution and development that is.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah. I'll go on because I want to just get back to talk a little bit about psychoanalysis as well. So the psychoanalyst Serge Tisserand suggests that writing and drawing have a common origins for the child in the failure to realize the drive to cling to the mother's body, which other primates can achieve owing to the mother's thick fur. Deprived of this by the human mother's comparative hairlessness, the baby has to substitute compensatory achievements to deal with this essential frustration. Such an approach no longer presents the world as a projection of the body itself, but as a projection of the maternal body from which every human being is originally separated. The human child compensates this lost dual unity through genital and non-genital substitutes. In the former, the hand replaces, this is a big quote from Tisserand, replaces some parts of the maternal body or hand and supplies the pleasures which the mother initially gave the child. These parts are sought through contacts with the world, nature, groups, institutions. According to this view, the hand is no longer regarded in relation to autoerotic pleasure, but in relation to the special role it plays in attempting to reconstruct symbolically the lost dual entity. At times, actions can be related to the epistemophilic impulse. The hand is then used to serve the desire for knowledge. At other times, it is used for the sexual impulse, in which it acts as an instrument of autoerotic fulfillment. However, it can be driven by its own needs, namely those concerning the end of the dual unity, which has been irretrievably lost. Gesturing, as emotional force distinct from the original stage of impulses, is a critical means of breaking away from maternal symbiosis. Gesture plays such a role in the young child's development, including the model of processes which childhood implements, as well as in any creative activity which calls for it, particularly writing, although this is dependent on the signifying constraints of grammatical and syntactical rules. And I don't know how many of you have watched a child draw. I'm now a step-grandfather, so I've had a chance to think about this. Drawing often involves a kind of going away and coming back gestural movement. So the gesture is a double process of marking space, that of the physical as well as the psychic distance separating the infant from the mother after birth, and that of the surface of the body itself. Tisserand points out how, quote, the appearance of the child's first markings coincides with newly acquired skills, including walking, sphincteral control, and language development. Thus, marking has a privileged relationship with the psychic process involved in the first separation, the separation of any human being from the mother or surrogate adult. Tisserand explicitly relates this to Freud's Fort Da game, and I guess you all know about the Fort Da. I'm not going to, yeah?
You can just go through it again, but we do, but go.
Sorry, I never quite know if I'm just being really OTOs and being obvious or not. So Freud observes, well, he describes it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle as a child. It's actually his grandson, Ernst, having a cotton bobbin on a piece of string, which he continually throws out of the cot and brings back. And as he throws out, he makes a noise like, or, as he brings it back, ah. And Freud interprets this to be for, meaning away, and da, meaning here. And for Freud, this is the process by which the child manages the symbolically the absence of the mother by substituting something, metaphorical for mother, in which case the cotton bobbin. And it's very important, or gets developed by other psychoanalysts in various ways. So Winnicott, it leads to the idea of the transitional object, the sort of soft toy or whatever. And in case of Lacan, it leads to his idea of the objet petit a, which I'll come back to in a bit. Yeah, but long story short, it's the symbolic way in which the mother's absence creates conditions in a way for its symbolic substitution by something else, which I would argue is really the fundamental basis of language, is to make up for an absence, in a sense. Language in signification as to mere signs. Animals have signs, but I think that humans signify because they can replace one thing, and therefore one word for something else that's not there, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway, so Tisserand explicitly relates this to Freud's Fort Da game. In particular, he compares the making of a mark to the throwing of the spindle. As the child carries out the marking gesture, he identifies with the departing mother. However, later, when considering the marks, the child identifies the trace, the movement of his or her hands left behind. The child is free to be the one that rejects the mother in the form of the trace which he sees as the mother separated from him. Another quote from Tisserand. The child's earliest graphic activity thus constitutes a place where the processes of the early mother-child relationship are produced and stabilized. It represents a first containing structure for the child, while movements serve the process of early symbolization. One of the things about Freud's understanding of the Fort Da is that he imagined that the child would get the most satisfaction from bringing the mother back. But he started to notice actually the child's greatest satisfaction was sending mother away. And there is something really interesting about this. I call it matripetal and matrifugal movements that are quite ambivalent about the presence of the mother as being both desired, but also quite possibly to be separated from. And I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to say there. So I want to now, any other questions about that? Because I'm going to turn to the next bit. Anybody got any thoughts or questions they want to clarify?
I was just thinking, as you were saying, and Charlie, about love and hate, and Melanie Klein, the sort of, the mother and the father towards you, and then hating them as well. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there's a whole the relationship between the sort of notion of movement away and to in psychoanalysis, whether it's Klein, Lacan, Winnicott, Freud, how it sort of plays itself out often through images that relate to walking and feet, and really, completely compelling to me in a way. Anyway, I'll go on. So now I'm going to get myself deep and dirty into Lacan. So I warn you, those who have a Lacanophobia, that this is now the moment in which he comes in. So central to the Freudo-Lacanian account of the development of human subjectivity is the process of individuation necessary for the child to separate itself from the mother-child dyad. This is determined by the entry into symbolic order, which in turn entails the loss of the maternal object and its substitution in language, which I think is what Fort Da is kind of doing. For Lacan, at least in Seminar 7, das Ding, the thing, is the name of the void of the missing signifier around which subjectivity forms and which originates, at least in some reading, with the mother. In the Dictionary of Lacanian Psychoanalysis, Dylan Evans suggests that, quote, das Ding is the lost object which must be continually refound. It is the prehistoric, unforgettable other. In other words, the forbidden object of incestuous desire, the mother. It creates the void and therefore thereby introduces the possibility of filling it. So this is me now. Emptiness and fullness are introduced into a world that by itself knows not of them. There is no absence in the real. Nothing is lacking in the real. It's only lacking in signification. This is a very important point, I think, in Lacan. It is on the basis of this fabricated signifier that emptiness and fullness as such enter the world, neither more nor less, and with the same sense. Lacan calls das Ding the beyond of the signifier. In Shuli Bartzilai's words, and it's a Lacanian theorist, unlike things in the world of persons, places, and objects, das Ding is nowhere and everywhere. Barzilai suggests that contra the Freudian speculation that social, religious, and cultural institutions are outcome of the slaying of the primal father, Lacan posits das Ding as the empty gravitational center around which civilization comes into existence. Lacan defines how the different discourses of art, science, religion organize themselves around the emptiness of das Ding. Art sort of surrounds its emptiness. Religion consists of avoiding this emptiness, filling this emptiness with God, if you like. And science engages in the position of the paranoid subject, defined by Lacan as not wanting to know anything about the spot where truth is in question. So in a sense, this absence is denied in science. This is probably too dense a passage to unpack properly at the moment. But anyway, Lacan explains how Freudian theory is based on postulating a world of desire. The Freudian world isn't the world of things, it isn't the world of being, it is a world of desire as such. According to Lacan, desire is a relation to a being to lack. This lack is the lack of being, properly speaking. It isn't the lack of this or that, but the lack of being whereby the being exists. This lack is beyond anything which can represent it. It is only ever represented as a reflection on a veil. End quote. Thus, desire, quotes, a function central to all human experience, is the desire for nothing nameable. Therefore, the largest part of what the subject takes to be certainty after due reflection is for us only the superficial, rationalized, subsequently justified ordering of what his desire ferments, which gives his world and his action its essential curvature. At the heart of human subjectivity, of humanness itself, is something missing that language tries and always fails to fill. Alenka Zupančič, she's a Lacanian theorist from Slovenia, a sort of protege of Žižek, Slavoj Žižek, the sort of well-known person. Alenka Zupančič suggests, following Nietzsche, that we are not half human or half animal, but just half animal, incomplete, or in her words, an animal aborted before it was finished, and of culture and morality as taking place at or as anchored precisely in this point of ontological incompleteness of being animal. Part of this ontological incompleteness is the lack of sexual relation that Jacques Lacan recognizes as key to our human subjectivity. How men and women enter into the symbolic order, or what Lacan calls symbolic castration, means that their respective desires do not match, and that the dream of recovering some state of oneness is impossible. For Lacan, men search for this lost and impossible oneness in the form of the objet petit a, which for him is a little trace of the lost jouissance. So if you, to put this blunt, if you really fancy somebody, what you're really fancying is an objet petit a, a tiny trace of some lost jouissance that you think you see in them, but is actually illusory. I tell my students this, and they all get very disappointed.
And the jouissance is, so I think I know that word.
Yeah, so jouissance is the French for sort of pleasure, but jouissance means an overwhelming sensation that is both pleasurable and too much. Jouir is also to come, like orgasm in French. Yes. And so what the mother's body offers is jouissance, which we both want and want to run away from. So it's a kind of double thing, yeah. Jouissance, it's a sort of unbearable, but sort of desire-forming pleasure. And what we replace for that is a trace of jouissance in the form of the objet petit a. It's of a desire we can never fully render, yeah? Our subjectivity is structured around or through this lack and the sense that something is missing. A part has been separated from us. The objet petit a, the little object A, is a little reminder or remainder or ghost of what is already lost, and thus is not an object that has now been lost, but was always already lost. It is a constitutive lack that produces the desiring subject, the lost object that produces desire in the first place. As Sean Homer puts it, the object I is not therefore an object we have lost, because then we'd be able to find it and satisfy our desire. It is rather the constant sense we have as subjects that something is lacking or missing from our lives. We are always searching for fulfillment, for knowledge, for possessions, for love. And whenever we achieve these goals, there is always something more we desire. We cannot quite pinpoint it, but we know that it is there. This is one sense in which we can understand the Lacanian real as the void or abyss at the core of our being that we constantly try to fill out. The object art is both the void, the gap, and whatever object momentarily comes to fill that gap in our symbolic reality. What is important to keep in mind here is that the object art is not the object itself, but the function of masking the lack. That's the end of quote from Homer. It is the object caused desire, not its object, that curves round the void or lack to set desire in motion. This desire, any desire, cannot be satisfied. Any attempt to close the gap on desire means its cessation. The impossibility of satisfying desire makes desiring subject possible. So the loss or lack we feel is foundational for our very subjectivity. In Todd McGowan's words, the subject as such emerges through the experience of loss. McGowan describes this in terms of a sacrifice that, quotes, creates both subject and object because of what the subject has lost of itself. The subject takes an interest in the object world because it forms this world around its lost object. This sacrifice involves alienation in language from the world, which is also a precondition of our having a world at all. So a quote from McGowan. Prior to its immersion in the mediation of language, the subject had no object at all, not a privileged relation to objects, but a complete absence of relationality as such, due to its autoeroticism. In this sense, the subject's willingness to accede to its alienation in language is the first creative act, a sacrifice that produces the objects that the subject cannot directly access. Language is important not for its own sake, but because it is the site of our founding sacrifice, end of quote. Yet, this is a sacrifice of nothing. There is no prior wholeness with either the subject itself or its parent. It is this sacrifice of nothing that, quotes, gives birth to desire. The subject sacrifices nothing in order to create a lost object around which it can create its desire. For Ellie Ragland, that there is no sexual relation is the very basis of culture itself. To prevent, as a quote from Ragland, to prevent lack and loss from making us into monads or psychotics, we are driven to produce culture. And insofar as the masculine and feminine positions differ, the key element lies in response to sexual difference, which pushes the masculine to identify knowledge with language and imposes on the feminine the burden of taking up the real as a problem, end quote. Next quote. This is again from Ragland. There is no sex relation, Lacan said. This lack gives rise to speech as proof of the lack of a unifying relation, the lack that calls for a social link. Speech bears the burden of forging a social bond, which does not exist in the non-dialectical absolutism of jouissance, which is the antithesis of speech. At a place of thirdness between language and jouissance, Lacan infers the object A, which speaks the body and about which the body speaks. It materializes language around the drive to satisfy desire, destroying the illusion that either a couple or a sexual identity will ever become one. End quote. Any questions there? Because I know it's quite an intense thing.
I had one thought about this idea. I guess I was thinking maybe anthropologically or culturally about the desire that comes from the loss of the mother type of thing, and seeking that little petit a, I think it was. And it makes me think of, yeah, to what extent, like to what extent romanticism as a tradition and love and these things, the culture that we've created there has, whether Lacan's work here is on the basis, that's actually speaking about the desire that's been manufactured through that rather than something that's innate to us type of thing.
What I think Lacan would say is that the object R need not necessarily be a woman or a man, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Or be invested in, it could be something else.
Yeah.
I think what he would say is that starting around the late or middle medieval period, woman becomes a privileged object in the male imaginary,
Mm-hmm.
possibly to do with secularization. The object, he's particularly interested in the tradition of courtly love, you know, which essentially starts with the troubadours, in which a woman is rendered unobtainable by the male as a kind of figure, in which desire can be kept alive through that. But I think that, you know, the previous objets are, or previous objects in which fill our void might be, for example, God, you know, and that culturally the emphasis on the female figure as this kind of, as the almost sole object within the popular culture is specifically modern and very problematic. And one of the reasons I'm writing this is to try to understand what I see as a kind of innate cultural misogyny in which overinvests in a certain object because it has a psychoanalytical sort of, it has become the place that fulfills a psychoanalytical need. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think that does make sense.
Yeah. Lacan is actually much more historical than people think he is. And you know, he's very concerned with what happens in the modern world, i.e. from the 17th century onwards. And the specific conditions that produce our specific kinds of sexual relations that may have other manifestations in different times, different cultures.
Is there something, is there something about what you mentioned at the start about us kind of only being, that we're half animal, as opposed to that there's a lack of wholeness, and that the feminine represents the kind of growth, and something very natural and something very sort of connected to the earth, so like Mother Earth type idea, and that from that period of time we've increasingly kind of corroded our connection with nature and being part of the natural world and being animals ourselves. And a lot of our cultures are kind of increasingly trying to take away the kind of reverence towards nature and connection towards nature in terms of symbolism and ritual practices and communal practices.
Yeah, I think those were precisely the kinds of places or events that would enable a relationship to Das Ding, you know, in a sense. The first environment is the mother. I mean, that's just simply true, you know, that we are carried in a womb for 9 months, and then we are in a very close relationship with the primary carer, which bluntly is usually the mother, for better or worse. And so in a sense, there is a very complex thing. And I haven't really been able to unpack this quite yet, between exactly how we regard the environment with a mix of reverence and kind of abuse, and how we might be in a kind of Fort Dar relationship with the maternal figure. I think there's a lot to be said about that. So one of Lacan, and actually, no, tell you what, I'm not going to answer that question anymore, because I think it's going to come now. I'm going to, in the sense where I'm going now, might get us there. Yeah.
Just one question. Sorry, one more question about what you were saying about speech and touch. Speech replaces the need for a physical contact.
Speech doesn't replace the need for it. The need is always there. The need is unsatisfiable. What it does is offer a kind of way of addressing that need. If you watch a small child, children are always demanding. Yeah. And what they're demanding is a return of love, right? Whatever they say they're demanding is a call for love, basically. But speech is the only means we can do that. If you watch a child, as I said, I watch my step-grandson, you know, that it is a continual attempt to demand something that he as yet cannot really articulate in speech. That is not at all like how animals demand things. Looking around as that dog's about to start barking, they're not demanding some attention from me of a different sort. So I think from the Kenyan perspective, speech is that which we have to have in order to make up for the loss of our intuitive, instinctual relationship to our sort of mothers, or, you know, the maternal figure, because we've somehow lost something.
Okay.
Always here, there's loss and lack here. It's really important.
Sorry, Charlie, just one more. You art surrounding and religion filling emptiness. What was the third?
Science denying it.
Science denying it.
There's a point where truth, you know, science just doesn't have any, I mean, these are very broad, and must get Lacan's statements made in seminars. They're quite often quite provocations, but his point is that science never brings into question, for example, gender difference, and its complexities as being a problem or something that might need to be dealt with in terms of truth. So it's, yeah, now I can point you to the right bit of Seminar 7, I think. But anyway, we'll go on. So for later Lacan, the order of signification is founded on or made possible by this lack or gap, a missing signifier. In Alenka Zupančic's words, quote, human history begins not with the emergence of the signifier, but with one signifier gone missing. We could indeed say that nature is already full of signifiers and at the same time indifferent to them, and that at some point one signifier falls out, goes missing, and it is only from this that the logic of the signifier in the strict sense of the term is born. Signifiers start to run and relate to each other across this gap. In this sense, and from this perspective, speech itself is already a response to the missing signifier, which is not there. Speech is not simply composed of signifiers. Signifiers are not the sufficient condition of speech. The condition of speech, as we know, the condition of speech as we know it is one signifier less. Humans are beings roused from indifference and forced to speak, as well as to enjoy, since enjoyment appears at the place of this deficit, by one signifier gone missing. And this, I'll go back to Todd McLaren to explain this a bit more. The fundamental symbolic deadlock, the root of the disorder that plagues every signifying system, involves the binary signifier or the signifier of the feminine. The absence of this signifier prevents the operations of social order from running smoothly. Nothing necessitates, of course, that the missing signifier had to be the signifier of femininity, as it is in patriarchal society. One can envisage a different structure with a different binary signifier, but we cannot conceive of a successfully completed signifying structure or a structure without a missing binary signifier. There will always be a missing signifier. They won't always be the signifier of the feminine. The subtraction of this signifier marks a founding moment of the social order as such, and thus it is impossible for us to experience. It is instead a condition for the possibility of the experience. Which now brings us back to the prehistoric origins of human technicity and subjectivity. If you remember, people like Stiegler and Lois-Gahon see technicity in the human kind of co-evolving owing to bipedality, right? So when Lacan is thinking about this lack and the notion of the thing, he cites early cave art, such as that found in Altamira, which I think is in Spain, as evidence of engagement with the emptiness of the thing. So he thinks that the very first elements of human culture were actually engagements with the thing. There's no way of proving this, of course, but let's just take it as a kind of supposition. Yeah? And he says this is where we find what we describe as a central place as intimate exteriority or extimacy, that is the thing, that will help us shed light on the question or mystery that remains for those who are interested in prehistoric art, mainly its site as such, i.e. why are they in caves? Why are these images in caves? And he says because they are images that surround and acknowledge the void of the thing. And following that, Henry Sullivan, who's actually a literary professor, but very interested in Lacan, traces the emergence of human culture to the explosion of representations and artifacts in the Upper Paleolithic era. He quotes André Lois-Gahon's analysis of cave painting as structured in terms of sexual difference, which is, for Lacan, quotes, an impasse or irreducible real which resists satisfactory symbolization. The effort of culture is to try to express this difference anyway, and the successive efforts to express it might in one sense be considered the history of culture. Thus, Sullivan suggests, we may have the key to the famous great leap forward of the Upper Paleolithic era. Desire is the motor of human history, but also of human prehistory. Before there was Homo sapiens, there must have been Homo desiderans, desiring man. For Sullivan, explanations of our particular evolutionary development, particularly in relation to language, that talk immediately of brain size, neurons, frontal lobes, gene pools, and the like, are looking for the right answer in the wrong place. Sullivan follows Jacques Lacan in distinguishing between animal communication that has a fixed correlation of its sign to the reality they signify, and human language. Even non-human primate communication is best described as vocalization rather than language. Non-human primates have the apparatus producing a wide range of sounds, but do not use it fully. However, writes Sullivan, according to Philip Liebman and others, humans have evolved the means of efficient phonation at the expense of respiration. Every time I get to this sentence, I start to lose my breath, and I realize I'm actually demonstrating exactly what I'm talking about, that we can actually talk while still not breathing properly. And also laughter comes to this. That's the whole bit here I can't quite unpack properly in the time given, but there is issues around our evolution of our vocal capacities. What makes difference, according to Sullivan, is desire, which is built around the loss discussed above. Sullivan goes so far as to ask, are the elementary stone tools to be regarded as indications of human desire? Here there might seem to be a possible connection between the work of Lacan and that of Bernard Stiegler and his understanding of originary technicity, in which it is the tool, that is technically, that invents the human, not the human that invents the technical, or the human invents himself by inventing the tool, by becoming exteriorized technologically in the form of tools such as flint axe heads. However, as Alexander R. Galloway points out, Stiegler almost never engaged with Lacan. However, a single sentence in the first volume of Techniques and Time offers a potential Lacanian slant to Stiegler's thought. He writes that flint is the first reflective memory, the first mirror. And sure, somebody may be aware of the importance of the mirror and the mirror stage in Lacan's thought, in which an illusory image of wholeness is given to the child seeing their reflection in a mirror, while they're still composed of unintegrated drives. So that this is the image also of kind of bipedal erectness. So perhaps the flint is the precursor of Ernst Freud's bobbin, Winnicott's transitional object, and Lacan's objet art. Thus, following Lacan Sullivan, perhaps the earliest flint tools, and all our tools since up to smartphone, are objet petit art, and the specific human relationship to technicity is one of lack and desire. I'm going to stop there. There is some more stuff, but I've got thousands of words which I could do. But I think that's probably a good point to stop and have a discussion.
Thank you.
Del.
So, yeah, let's see what happens. What these thoughts, questions?
I mean, maybe if anybody wants me to clarify anything that I went past too quickly, perhaps that'd be one thing we could start with, because I know there's quite a lot to take on board.
Well, I'd like to do that, to take you up on that. There is something though. I mean, when you were just talking about, I can't remember what you just said about towards the end about the mobile phones. I started to think about, you know, how much, because there's a generation that's always on the phones, on their mobile phones, and people talk about, you know, playing, instead of sleeping at nights, they're on their mobile phone all night. And I think in a way that sort of seems to feed into what you're talking about, doesn't it? Quite
completely. And it's funny that the bit I haven't spoken to, which I won't do, but it's just interesting that Lacan, way back in sort of 1960s or early 70s, Seminar 17, actually more or less starts talking about these little objects we're surrounded by that are now become the objet petit art. You know, the phone is, I mean, if you Google mobile phone transitional object Winnicott, you'll get a whole bunch of people saying the mobile phone has become our sort of ubiquitous objet petit art transitional object substitute for the maternal. I show students a cartoon I found of the phone as a kind of mother coming to embrace the child. it's quite, I mean, yeah, completely. But I think, see, the point I want to retro engineer that thought and say yes, but is that when we talk about the very, very early makers of tools, in a sense, the tool, whether it was a flint axe or a basket, was that also not similarly a substitute for something? Not just something that's there for its usability, but something that actually has this relationship to this missing signifier, this way of doing things in the absence of stuff that gives a psychoanalytical slant to the Stieglerian idea of originary technicity. And that, you know, is a something that stretches from the very earliest stone tools to the mobile phone as being part of the same continuum of substitutional objects.
Yeah. Yeah, so, certainly much easier to see it on the mobile phone end than the earlier end, but you know, that doesn't.
If you think about it backwards, you know, you say, well, okay, yeah. I mean, it obviously doesn't. It's less obvious, but in a way, our relationship to our phone. I mean, I have mine here.
Me too. Somewhere, just in front of me here, never far from it. So
never far, and always touched onto.
Yeah,
it's pretty symptomatic, but it also shows how much we haven't. Perhaps he always did. a considerable development, a desire, an investment of desire in our objects. You know, they're not just there for use. We invest them.
Yes.
I mean, the other object, which I often think about this, is the book. Book as a thing, you know, it's so much an objet as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Freud says somewhere about language being, isn't it? Something about the voice. I think something about the voice of the mother, or the voice of the absent person, or something like that. Like,
yeah, completely. I think language is exactly that. It is that which, in a sense, we listen to, trying to find the mother. You know, it's kind of, and I think that's what Lacan is saying. You know.
I often find myself thinking about how powerful the phone is compared to a static object, and to go back to the idea of the child rejecting the mother, telling the mother to go away, as not a rejection, but the creation of an opportunity. That is, tell the mom to go away, and then see that the mother cares, because the mother will come back.
Yes,
and the same thing with the phone. That unlike a static object, we put our phone down, and the phone calls to us.
Yeah.
You know, a sound happens or something happens, and so I wonder about that with the mother, it's less of go away, I don't want you, and it's more of a test, like a social, you know, sort of test, you know, like will they come back?
Yeah, or the other thing is, can I have a substitute for the mother sufficiently myself that I don't require her presence? Am I confident enough in her absence?
Yes.
It
can never be attained, can it? It's always a false hope. It's always disappointment, isn't it?
Always.
Therefore, desire has to be horizontal.
Yes. Desire can never be satisfied. Need can be satisfied. Now, this is the difference in need and desire, which is a very important, I think, point largely from Lacan, that we have needs we can satisfy, but we can never, ever satisfy desire.
And that's, I think, the difference between humanism and Lacanian psychoanalysis, because humanism need, and Freud somewhere in the middle with drive or something. I don't know, but it's we certainly have an enormous difference with regard to Lacan's bringing and privileging that notion of desire.
What did you say, Del? Humanism what, sorry? Humanism as need?
Well, in humanism, you get, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. See? In humanism, they talk about needs. They don't talk about desire. Yeah? And I think that's a very big difference.
I mean, to be honest, reason why I find Lacan so beguiling, though he's a very infuriating person to read, is that when I do get to understand him, he does seem to answer my lived experience. Literally, that the notion of lack and desire. Though, on the other hand, I think there is a gendering issue here, and Lacan again would say that the way that people who sexuate as men and sexuate as women, he's not at all a biological essentialist here, but people who find themselves in the position of the masculine subject or the feminine subject, their relationship to the field of desire is different, you know, and so different things are sort of wanted, desired in different ways. There's a whole bunch of algebraic topological diagrams he does, which I kind of like, because they're sort of really annoying, because they're kind of fun. But, you know, the question of lack, for me, does articulate a very great deal around what human culture is as something that kind of tries to fill that gap and tries to deal with that.
Can I ask something? I'm just thinking what you were saying, Peter, about like the phone being the kind of a substitute of, if we should call it that, you know, substitute object. But does it matter then that now we can use the phone to actually see here the object that we are lacking or desiring, like the mother? I can use the phone, I can see her, and I can hear her on this phone, which I can't do with the bobbin or anything else. Do you think it matters?
Ooh, that's a very good point. I think because you're not really seeing the mother, you're seeing an image of the mother, albeit one that is, you know, live and so forth.
Yeah, a representation. A
representation that has some indexical relationship to the real, or the reality of the mother, yes. And perhaps part of the beguiling quality of the phone is it offers exactly what the bobbin doesn't offer, which is somewhere between the symbolic and the real, or something like that. Because I mean, it'd be interesting to think about the phone and the voice when the phone first came along, how much that in some ways gave a maybe slightly false sense of the desire being more satisfiable through hearing the voice of the person. And for those of us old enough to be pre-mobile phones, I put my hand up to remembering the sort of strange way the phone operated in terms of interpersonal relationships, particularly with sort of the opposite sex in my case.
I wonder if a slightly different way that you might respond to that maybe is maybe something about, you know, the mother that is going to satisfy this desire, need. It's not going to be. It's the mother of the infant, isn't it? It's not. It's no. I'm not sure how much it's the mother now, as it's. Go on. Sorry.
I would say that the mother of the infant is always present, and that memory of that is present, even though your mother now isn't that mother. You're right, and the mother of the infant is a kind of phantasmatic figure, right? It's not. It's got very little. I mean, I wonder and worry that a great deal of the kind of ubiquitous misogyny, for example, that we see is a failure to sort of disentangle people from that sort of over intense phantasmatic relationship, particularly men who therefore believe that there is some way back to that via women.
Yes.
And that is, you know, it clearly leads to some terrible sorts of forms, well, violence and all sorts of things. But yeah, you're right. But I think these, you know, we don't ever go away from these things. They're there, but they remain kind of.
No, you're talking about more. It's kind of like let's say a fantasy of reunion in a way. About the mother. So even if you speak to the mother now, it's not that. No, that is it that you want.
No, what you want is the sort of, I think Freud and Beyond the Pressure principle connects almost the oceanic notion of the sort of the oneness with the universe that he understood to be the source of religion, to be connected to the experience and desire for oneness with the maternal. I think it's quite explicit in Beyond the Pressure principle. I think, Richard, you're about to say something.
Sorry, Richard.
Well, yeah, my thoughts keep shifting. I keep wanting to say something, and then I feel like I'm just desiring to say something, I guess. But I'm just wondering then what we're doing here, really. And it's like sometimes I feel like, having been in therapy now for nearly 10 years, it's like all that seems to be available to me is to talk about the ways in which I can't satisfy my desires. And there's something satisfying about that, I think, in what we're doing here. We're kind of getting off on talking about the ways in which we can't really get off. And that seems to be where we're at. And I've tried many times with drugs and women and sex and games and books and writing music to try and be in a place of to try and be in the desire, you know. And it can work. I mean, for a short time. I think that's the problem.
Yeah,
maybe that's the problem, is that, you know, I've felt myself in sex, in music, in drugs, thinking, if this could last forever, my God, it would be. There's something very, very narcissistic about that, maybe.
If it could last forever, it'd destroy you. You know, if you have permanent jouissance, you'd be absolutely destroyed by it, I think. Bit in Milan Kundera, where somebody, he imagines having all the orgasms he had just continually as one, and how terrifying that would be.
Well, Milan Kundera also said that you can only have about 3 or 4 really good 3 or 4 good occasions of sex throughout your whole life, basically. I don't know, that was so hard for me to get the words out there.
But, well, interesting to think about that. But anyway, I'm not your therapist, so I won't. I think the point is that my view is that once you accept and actually enjoy, if that's possible, the impossibility of desire, or at least not enjoy it, at least kind of understand it to be the thing that makes it possible, and then somehow, at least intellectually, be able to see that whatever you may feel, you're never going to get there, but you should be there now in that moment of thinking about it. I think the difference between a kind of humanist, just to go back to Dell's point, and a sort of Lacanian, is that the humanist legacy of psychoanalysis does believe in recuperation, and, you know, things can be kind of made better. What I like about Lacan is he doesn't. It's, this is what it is. It's quite close to a kind of harsh form of Buddhism, as far as I'm concerned. The impossibility of desire. It's
going back to, I just wanted to ask, going back to the sort of idea of the objet art at a very kind of prehistoric level being, a flint or something. In your looking into this, is there any kind of distinction between functional objects that do further a need or a pursuit of a need and symbolic objects?
Well, I think that's an interesting point. And obviously a flint does appear to be an entirely symbolic object. And I wonder, entirely utilitarian object in the sense it does look like it's for. We have no idea with what feelings and desires the person who made that flint had, and what kinds of investment in that object they may have had in the artistry with which it was made, the expression of sort of the facture of something, so the degree to which that might of itself involved a form of desire.
There's something about the sort of act of creation that is part of the pursuit, isn't there? Sorry, my cat's joining in.
Yeah. No, I think I know maybe what would be interesting is to think about those parts of a flint, going however far back you want to go, that aren't necessary, that actually exceed the utilitarian quality and produce something that is done for its own sake, and it turns an object, however useful it might be at one level, into something more than just a tool. Yeah. Because this may be where culture comes in, is that I'm not just thinking off the top of my head, but some kind of investment in the excess of engaging with something beyond the most pure functionality is maybe something to do with culture and desire, or the relationship between culture and desire. That there's an excess to what we do. We do things beyond what we need to. Almost always. We don't have to do this. We could all just go and sort of, we don't have to be sitting here talking about this stuff, do we?
It's in the way we go about trying to find that never obtainable magical thing that is in drugs or writing a song or napping a flint in a certain way. That
what happens on the way? I mentioned some or many of you may have written books or done writing, and I've certainly done quite a lot of written books. And the only point, when the book's done, it's just, so what? The only pleasure in writing the book is when it's not yet finished, when I'm still open to what it might be, that it might be the book that stops all the other books.
Well, that's what Dell said about something about Horizon.
Yeah, exactly. Horizon will say the moment you finish one book, you realize you've got to start another, because that book hasn't really done it. It's just another piece.
Something of Derrida's eternal deferral in there as well.
Eternal deferral. Yeah, well, that's what it feels like, the eternal kind of sense that we're never going to get there. But the great illusion is to imagine that you can. The psychotic illusion is to think that somehow, if I get this woman, this book, this car, this something, if I become president of the United States, I'm thinking of Trump in particular as somebody who imagines that all his problems can be solved by, the realization of the things he thinks will make him better, cure him.
Attainment.
They haven't. And it's what keeps us going, I think.
Can I just go back, Charlie, to what you started with, the bipodality?
Yes.
Perhaps you could help me with regard to, with linking that with what you've now been I'm sure you said it, but if you could say it again, with regard to linking that to what we're now speaking about with regard to desire. I also say that when you first started talking about it, it just made great sense to me. And as Nell was saying, about thinking, standing on one's feet and things like that. But I then sort of thought, it's the reverse is also true, isn't it? Because I haven't got this right, but the whole notion of standing orders, wasn't it, where the king or queen would sit, and the people coming would have to stand and be, and not be able to continue. And there's that phrase, isn't there, that they kept me standing.
Yeah. But standing it's an immensely overdetermined, ambiguous, notion, yes, sitting is the privilege of not having to stand, but it still presupposes you're standing, that it's a release from standing as being the main condition. So there's such a degree of sort of doubleness in standing that it is both our dignity, it has a whole set of phallic overtones, we stand erect, quite literally. There's a whole, in the book, I talk quite a lot about the way that Kant uses notions of standing, or Plato. Kant talks about how we stand and look at the starry sky above and the moral law within, and he's got full of these images of the subject as somebody who stands erect, masculine, or Plato having the chained prisoner leave the cave and come out and stand in the midday sun. So these are images that are themselves quite gendered and charged with certain kinds of imagery. On the other hand, standing can be seen as something that also has a positive valence, especially maybe, standing up for yourself, the suffragettes standing up for their rights and so forth. You can never quite get to the end of standing because I think it remains, or bipodality, with all its exceptions, it remains the kind of dominant metaphor through which we understand ourselves.
It's funny to say understand.
Understand.
Yeah, understand. Now you're right. See, once you start, I didn't see that, but yeah, completely.
There's also a way of, I don't know, that sitting could be more associated with thoughtfulness, and when one's kept standing, then one can be taken for a bit of a ride because one can't think things through.
Yes. Yeah, on it goes. I mean, so Tim Ingold writes this brilliant essay. Tim Ingold, the anthropologist, talks about the fact that the majority of cultures don't sit in chairs; they squat. Throughout human history, and that he says two things: firstly, sitting, and secondly, the sort of Western shoe, the kind of 19th century shoe with its big sole or whatever, are things that divorce us from our relationship to the ground. And he sees a kind of correlation between the sort of mind-body dualism and the act of sitting and the act of wearing shoes and the sort of loss of sitting. So there's a lot of...
Sorry, the thing that I've about this as well, that maybe it's totally irrelevant, but it's making me think of birth was done on the feet. Women would birth on their feet.
Oh, yes.
And now there was a shift again in like the 1700s where it became a popular thing to birth lay down, so it could be witnessed by men without a connection to the floor of the feet.
Right.
Whereas traditionally it's a squatting position where the feet are in connection to the earth.
I'm nicking that. I'm having.
Interesting. Credit me for that.
No, I think that's, and I think you could probably think of all sorts of ways that in the modern West, in about the 16th, 17th century, if you read the work of someone like Silvia Federici, the Italian feminist writer, who writes a lot about the sort of rise of witchcraft as being part of a change towards capitalist modes of production that require a different relationship between the genders. One's much less cooperative and much more sort of distinct. And there's also the rise of modern notions of scientific scrutiny, what Heidegger calls the age of the world picture, in which the woman becomes much more of an image. I think this is really true. So that is really good. I'm going to have to, I'm afraid, take advantage of that. Standing. Yeah, so squatting basically. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot there. I mean, the problem at this subject, as I have discovered, is once you start, it never stops.
It's huge.
Never stops giving.
You touched on something twice, I think, at least, and maybe you said more than enough on it, and I just didn't follow it well enough. But there's something, isn't there, that you were saying about the power of the mother, which I think is related to this, and how, I'm not sure I know how to put it, but there's something, isn't it, about misogyny and about that's why you quoted Christova, the whole idea that there's some power in being able to throw the mother away.
I mean, one way of thinking about this is, so if you look at, let us say, the beauty industry practices, this is one way of getting into this, the insistence that women are made to stand up to impossible beauty standards that are, you know, the more equality there is, the more that other kinds of pressures come. How much of this is not just a form of repression and male anxiety, but also a fear of something that the surface is supposed to conceal, which is, you know, a fear of what Christopher might call the abject, Barbara Creed might call the monstrous feminine, something that is a part of the male imaginary, I think, that remains a source of overwhelming anxiety, I think, and which often turns into misogyny and quite often violence. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about the sort of figure of the woman walking, the vulnerable woman walking, and we all know about the awful things like Sarah Everard and the other women who are, well, it happens all the time, don't even name names. But what the particular sort of dramaturgy of that image of a woman walking away from somebody that enrages a man so much to do that, you know, do what the kind of acts they commit, at the same time as bound up with a kind of fear of aspects of the maternal feminine. I mean, it's a very complex area, but I think there is definitely a sense that the maternal is something both matripetal and matrifugal, I keep saying, you're drawn towards and flung away from. And again, Lacan is interesting about this. You know, he sort of says it's as much fear of the breast as desire for it that motivates sort of movement.
Is there possibly? I was just going to say, is there possibly something about? It's making me again think of birth, and if you see a woman giving birth who's standing on her feet, she's in a much more powerful position, like able to powerfully birth a baby, versus a woman who's lay on her back in a very vulnerable position, who needs the obstetrician to support her to birth the baby, and how the fear of the maternal also over time has become much more vast, certainly since the Inquisitions and things, and the witches that now we birth on our backs in hospitals, in medical structures, rather than very naturally in power.
You are, I mean, the whole kind of symbolism of the horizontality of giving birth against the sort of verticality of older forms of giving birth feeds straight into both issues around our relationship to bipedal, but also maybe how we conceive of women as sort of, I mean, you know, as part of a much broader picture of a kind of great shift in the understanding of sexes which took place, I think, in the early modern period, of which this is part, and which has a different version of our relationship to the maternal. Just seen a wasp in my room. How very unnerving.
I was going to say, maybe probably in the last sort of 20, 30 years, we're seeing much fewer men and women marry, particularly in the West. You know, fewer women are having children. And it just makes me wonder, I guess in a way, this analysis, it's in a way you could say it's quite traditional, it's quite historic, you know, the masculine sort of dominance over the woman. And yet we're also living in times of great change where, for some reason, I saw an article recently, I think it was in Time magazine, where partly because of economics, you know, it's just much more difficult for women to maybe even have the time anymore to have children. And I wonder in a way whether there's something changing as well in the kind of structure or the order of how things work in a way. I mean, it's a very big generalization. Yeah, but there's also change. Yeah, at the same time that there is still this very traditional kind of order.
Yeah. I would say that if you want to look at the roots of some of the current male anxiety about women, it would be due to changing social economic circumstances in which, for example, something like greater equality has happened, though of course it remains still very much not the case. But and that what you're seeing is not the patriarchy, which I always think is a slightly sort of simplistic term, but rather a considerable degree of disavowed male vulnerability and anxiety about women that is really part and parcel of our culture at the moment. And that when culture, big word, but when things change like this, it's a perturbation, isn't it? It's a kind of great shift in understanding of gender, understanding of social roles, understanding of the value of procreation, for example. When I was born, there were 3 billion people on this planet. There are now 8. I mean, in my lifetime, it's nearly gone 3 times, which is in itself a kind of interesting thing to think about in terms of how we think about human population, human destiny, whatever, in interesting ways.
It's interesting.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to very quickly say it's interesting. I think I read another article recently that men are particularly more likely these days to vote more conservative or Tory, and women are more likely to vote left. And I think it's a kind of backlash from men that they're seeing women more liberated, and they're, as you say, they're feeling perturbed or alienated, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, go on, Richard.
Well, I mean, I've done some reading around the manosphere, men going their own way, the incels, all that kind of thing, and an interesting reaction formation against the fear of female progress and sort of equality and so forth. It's very, very hysterical. By the way, let's all vote Labour. Just saying.
Richard, can I just, Richard, have the last question because we're at time now.
Yeah, sure. So I was just it was really interesting, everything you've said. I've been really interested in it, and it was sort of making me think about, I know you mentioned the kind of petty, whatever it was called, I can't remember.
Objet petit a.
Yeah, objet petit a. And it, in modern times could be kind of the phone, and perhaps in the past, I think you said it could have been something around God, or it could have been that role. And it made me think about all the different religions and the notion of this kind of unquenchable desire that we have, and the ways in which those religions treat and think about desire.
Yeah.
And actually how within kind of Christianity and all of those religions, they're very sort of, they impose rules and restrictions and kind of have guidelines around what it is that is desirable and what's not, and how you should kind of limit or curtail or dampen your own desire according to the will of the mother.
Yeah, I mean, so many interesting things to say there. Sorry, you're still speaking, but I can.
Yeah, but then it also made me think about in Buddhism, and how an absence of desire is the thing which is kind of enabling the person to remove themselves, and it's the most attractive part of the religion, I think, is to free yourself of the sort of.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would say religion is a way of managing desire.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. That if you posit God as the ultimate form of desire, which is what lots of religions, including Christianity, do, the language of desire in religion is very, very strong, even in Buddhism. If you posit something that is unobtainable as desire, you manage it much better than when you impose upon, let us say, actual living human beings to be the repository of that kind of object of desire. So one argument might be that religion acts as not as a way of disavowing desire or denying it, but actually finding an appropriate, socially sort of easy to manage way of funneling your desire towards God. And Lacan's always talking about mysticism, religion. His example of jouissance is a statue of St. Teresa by Bernini in Rome, which shows a woman clearly having an orgasm because it's a kind of act of jouissance. The second thing, and I know that we're running out of time, so I'll just finish this last point, is one of the more brilliant ways of thinking about desire is when Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, the Slovenian psychoanalyst, talks about the way that in the 19th century and earlier, when courting couples were accompanied by a chaperone, a sort of person supposed to sort of monitor their behavior. So the chaperone is there not to quench desire. The chaperone is there to cause desire by making it impossible to realize. By putting a barrier in front of it, you make desire happen. So, and there's I mean, I could spend another hour talking about that, but I won't. Good. I think I've got a feeling we've come to the end of our.
Well, I can't wait for the next hour, Charlie. But can we sort of thank Charlie for what sort of, at least temporarily, plugging our gap of desire in this last hour? You know, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I hope, you know, that when you're on the next chapter or the next book, we might hear from you again.
Yeah, I've always got tons to say. I could be a bit gossipy about Derrida, but maybe that's for another time.
That would be good. Yeah,
it'll be really good. Thank you so